Yeah, the sun is setting here in Sharm el Sheikh, and we still don't seem close to an agreement, although we do seem closer than we were just a couple hours ago. So, the big sticking point is this loss and damage fund. This is sometimes called climate reparations. It's a fund in which developed, rich countries would pay for the costs of climate change's effects in poor developing countries. This is something that 130 developing countries have asked for, but the US and the EU had opposed. On Thursday, the EU made a major U-turn and said they could accept the fund on two conditions: that all countries would agree to peak their emissions in 2025, that is, not have emissions going up anymore. They could go up the next 3 years, but then from 2025, everyone's emissions need to go down. And the other condition is that it needs to have a broad funding base. And by that, they mean China. They don't want China to receive this fund. They want China, as a rich country, as the most climate polluting country in the world, to pay for the fund. So this afternoon, we got a text from the Egyptian presidency accepting much of what was in the EU's compromise. However, it does very clearly exempt rich non-Western countries like China, like Saudi Arabia, from having to contribute to the fund. The argument being that they only had their wealth in recent times, and that they didn't contribute historically over the past century to the emissions that have gotten to us where we are now. The big question is whether the EU and the US can accept this text, and that's what we're waiting to hear. So far, we haven't heard any outright rejection from either side, although the US is more opposed to this idea than the EU. Even after the EU came out with this compromise on Thursday, the US has been very, very quiet. The US really doesn't want to establish any type of mechanism that would imply liability from rich countries to pay for the climate change damages that are happening in developing countries. Take, for instance, the recent floods in Pakistan. The idea of this fund is that rich developed countries would have to pay for the damage that those floods cause if it is proven to be an effect of climate change. So we'll see if there can be a breakthrough in the next couple hours.
Right. Dave, as you mentioned there, that's quite a thorny issue. Now, given what we've seen transpire during the last 2 weeks in Egypt, do you think countries still lack the will or the ambition to reduce their carbon emissions?
That was the big question hanging over this COP27 summit, is whether the global crises that we're facing right now, most notably the Ukraine war and the accompanying energy price crisis and energy supply crisis, whether that would dampen will to fight climate change. It certainly doesn't seem to have helped. It doesn't look like we're going to be really moving the needle at this summit. The big question about this text is whether we go backwards. We're sure now that the cover part of this agreement at the end of the summit will maintain the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. That is to make sure that temperature rises don't pass 1.5 degrees. However, if you look at the implementing texts around it, really close watchers of this stuff say, look, actually what's in the details of the text means that this summit is saying, is backing off from that 1.5 degree goal and kind of giving up on it and saying we will go over 1.5 degrees, specifically because the mechanisms in here would allow countries not to increase their climate reduction commitments over the coming years. So that's going to be key to watch. We know we'll get that 1.5 degree figure mentioned in the cover text. The key thing will be whether these implementing texts around it actually mean that 1.5 degrees is no longer possible. And if that was the case, that would be a major walk back from last year's COP26 in Glasgow. Also, a key thing to watch is whether they can flesh out this vague commitment we had last year in Glasgow to phase down coal use. We haven't really had much discussion about that here because the loss and damage issue has sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Will we get any further details about phasing down coal? At this point, it's looking unlikely.
Dave Keating, thanks so much for that. That's Dave Keating in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt.